He never danced, not at her graduation, not at her wedding, not even once. But as he lay dying, Lena came home. And what Keanu Reeves helped her create in their backyard became the moment that healed a lifetime of silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The phone rang just after sunrise, slicing through the soft hum of Lena's workshop fan. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her chest tightened before she even answered. A slow, sinking kind of knowing. It was her Aunt May. Her voice, steady but hollow. "Lena," she said softly, "he doesn't have much time." The words felt like gravel underfoot. Lena leaned against her workbench, surrounded by beads, wire, and unfinished turquoise pendants. Her fingers still held a half-shaped silver feather, the last in a batch she was making for an art festival in Albuquerque. It suddenly felt meaningless in her hand. Her father, James Redbird, had been a stoic shadow all her life, the kind of man who worked with his hands, fixed fences, sharpened tools, and believed emotions were meant to stay buried. Growing up, Lena tried everything to reach him. She carved him a bow from pine, mowed the lawn with a crooked blade, even rebuilt the broken porch steps when she was 14. He'd nod, sometimes say good, but never more. But they hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. Now May was telling her he had terminal cancer. The doctors had given him 2, maybe 3 months. Lena felt her chest tighten. She packed that night in silence. Her suitcase filled quickly. Warm sweaters, her turquoise tools, a sketchbook she hadn't used in months. As she zipped the bag, Lena glanced at the photo tacked above her workbench. It was the only one she had of her father smiling, barely. A ghost of a grin on the edge of a moment long gone. She was 9 in that photo, holding a beaded necklace she had made him for Father's Day. He hadn't worn it, but he'd kept it. Santa Fe shrank in her rearview mirror the next morning, disappearing into dust and dawnlight. Her small blue truck hummed gently beneath her as the miles rolled out ahead. She hadn't been back to the old house in over 7 years. It sat on the edge of the reservation, nestled between dusty hills and rows of cottonwood trees, the same ones she used to climb barefoot as a girl. As she drove, memories surfaced like splinters. Birthday parties where he never sang. A school play where he left before her scene, the way his silence filled every room they shared. Still, she had come, because somewhere deep down, part of her still wanted to be seen by him. She arrived just before sunset. The old truck crunched over the gravel driveway like it had never left. The house looked smaller than she remembered. Time had peeled the paint, bowed the porch railing, and dulled the windows, but the rocking chair was still there, sitting crooked, gently swaying in the wind as if waiting. Her aunt met her at the door with a weary smile. "He's inside," May said, "mostly resting." Lena stepped into the hallway, the air thick with the scent of cedar and something antiseptic. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoed back decades. Her father was in the back room, propped against faded pillows, his frame sunken but his eyes alert. When he looked at her, Lena braced herself. Would he scold her for taking so long? Would he ignore her like he used to? Instead, he gave a faint nod. Just that. No smile, no words. But it was enough to keep her standing there a little longer. "I'm here, Dad," she said gently. He blinked slowly. His hand twitched toward the edge of the blanket, but stopped short. She didn't push it. She simply unpacked her bags, set up in her old room, and began again. The days fell into rhythm quickly. Mornings began with silence. Lena made coffee, warmed oatmeal, and set out her father's medication. He rarely said more than a word or two, sometimes just a grunt. But he took the pills without protest. She trimmed his hair, clipped his nails, and gently rubbed balm on the calluses of his hands. Those same hands that once built fences and fixed engines without asking for help. Now they trembled with every movement. Still, he tried to lift his spoon, to fold his own blanket. Lena let him. Dignity mattered. In the afternoons, she cleaned the house room by room. Dust lay thick on every shelf, covering framed photographs and forgotten trinkets. She wiped them gently, often pausing on old pictures, her mother's long-lost smile, cousins at ceremonies, a younger version of herself standing near the river with her father in the background, always just out of focus. At night, she'd sit in her room sketching designs, listening to the ticking clock in the hallway. Some nights she cried quietly. Not because he was dying, but because part of her feared he might leave without ever really seeing her, without ever knowing she still loved him. One evening, as she brought in firewood, she noticed the rocker was empty. She found him near the shed, leaning against the post, breathing heavily. He'd tried to prune the rose bush, something her mother used to do every spring. "Should have done it weeks ago," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "You should have waited for me," she said gently, supporting him by the elbow. He grunted but let her guide him back to the porch. That night, she lit a candle and set it by the old wedding photo of her parents in the living room. Her mother had passed when Lena was just 15. After that, silence became her father's second skin. She stared at the flame, whispering into the stillness, "I wish you were here. I wish he knew how hard I tried." A creak on the floor behind her made her turn. Her father stood there, cane in hand, eyes on the candle. "She liked candles too," he said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her since she arrived. And with that, something shifted. Barely, like a door opening just wide enough to let in a sliver of light. Lena went to bed with hope stirring. The next morning, she brewed his coffee just the way he liked, black, with a pinch of cinnamon. She set it down on the side table next to his rocker and waited nearby. He took a sip, looked at her briefly, then nodded again. Not out of habit this time. There was something deeper behind it. Recognition, maybe? Or quiet appreciation. Lena went back to the kitchen and stared out the window. The backyard was overgrown, the grass patchy and the flower beds wilted, yet she noticed something curious. A row of small stones had been neatly laid near the fence line, not something her father would have done recently. She wondered if someone had been helping. Later that afternoon, her aunt mentioned the neighbor, Keanu, a quiet man who lived down the road. "He's been checking in on your dad every now and then," May said, slicing apples at the sink. "Mostly just leaves firewood or tidies up the garden. Doesn't say much." Lena filed the name away. It wasn't like her father to accept help from anyone. The fact that he had meant something. That night, as the wind whistled through the window pane, Lena held the warm mug between her hands and watched her father sleep. Days passed in quiet repetition. Lena began to find peace in the stillness, the way the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof, her father's slow breathing from the next room. But inside, a knot of longing remained. She didn't want a grand gesture or a final declaration. She just wanted connection, even a brief one. One morning, as she changed his bed sheets, he reached out and gently touched her wrist. His fingers were cool and shaky, but intentional. "You're a good one," he whispered. The words cracked something in her that had been holding on for decades. She nodded, blinking back tears, and placed her hand over his. "Thanks, Dad." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. Later, she opened her sketchbook for the first time since she arrived. She drew the rocker, the backyard tree, her father's hands folded in his lap, and beneath it, she wrote a single word: stillness. The next chapter in their story had begun. Not loud or cinematic, but slow, patient, and real. And Lena, for the first time in years, allowed herself to believe that maybe healing had already begun. That evening, as dusk settled over the hills, Lena stepped outside for fresh air. The stars were beginning to prick the sky, soft and distant, like tiny promises. As she leaned against the porch rail, she noticed movement at the edge of the property. A man in a worn flannel shirt was gathering fallen branches beneath the cottonwoods. He moved quietly, respectfully, like someone who understood the language of silence. When he glanced up and saw her, he simply raised a hand in greeting. She returned the gesture. So that was Keanu. She didn't call out or approach him. Somehow his distance felt right. Like he knew his role in this moment was to witness, not intrude. Inside, her father stirred. She heard the creak of the rocker and his cough. Dry but steady. She took one last look at the man under the trees, then stepped back into the house and closed the door behind her. It was only the beginning, but Lena could feel it in her chest. The past had brought her back, but the present was what might finally make them whole. Lena woke before the sun. The house was cold and quiet, save for the wind tapping gently against the window panes. She wrapped herself in a shawl and padded barefoot into the kitchen, where the kettle hissed softly atop the old stove. The smell of cedar and dust clung to the air, remnants of years lived and left behind. As the kettle began to whine, she glanced down the hallway toward her father's room. The door was slightly ajar, just like he used to leave it when she was a little girl and afraid of the dark. It used to mean, "I'm here, but don't make me say it." Now it just meant, "I'm still breathing." She made breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee, and placed it on a tray beside his chair in the living room. He was already awake, staring at the muted television without really watching. His eyes drifted to the tray, then to her. A slow nod, then nothing more. They ate in silence. Later that morning, she wandered outside. The shed stood where it always had, leaning slightly to one side, its wood splintered and sun-bleached. She hesitated at the door, hand hovering over the rusty latch. She opened the shed and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Old leather, motor oil, and sawdust. Tools hung in neat rows along the wall, untouched in years. A dusty bow sat in the corner, its grip cracked and string long gone. Lena walked over and picked it up, running her fingers over the wood grain. This was the first thing she ever made with her hands. She'd been 10. Her father hadn't helped, just watched from a distance. When she finished, she'd brought it to him, smiling with pride. He'd looked at it, nodded once, then said, "It'll pull left." That was it. She put the bow back gently, her breath shallow. She stepped outside and looked across the yard. The garden was overgrown with weeds, the once orderly rows of corn and squash now a mess of tangled stems and dry earth. But in one corner she noticed something curious, a single patch of lavender, growing tall and vibrant, her mother's favorite. She crouched beside it and touched the petals softly, blinking against tears she hadn't expected. Maybe some things did survive after all, even when no one tended them. Maybe memory had its own roots. That afternoon she swept the kitchen. The broom bristles caught on every crevice in the worn wooden floor. With each stroke, she uncovered forgotten fragments, an old marble, a child's crayon, a nail half embedded in the boards. Little fossils of a life that had kept moving forward, even when the people inside didn't know how. Her father stayed in the rocker most of the day, occasionally coughing or shifting in his seat. He didn't comment on the cleaning, but she caught him glancing at the newly cleared table once, then quickly looking away. At dinner, she made chili the way her mother used to, thick, spicy, with crushed blue corn chips on top. She set the bowl in front of him and waited. He took one bite, then two. No words, but he finished it all. Later, she stood at the sink, scrubbing dishes in silence, when she felt his presence behind her. He didn't speak, just placed his empty bowl gently on the counter beside her and turned away. To anyone else, it might have meant nothing, but Lena felt it. It was an offering, a thank you without syllables. At night, Lena lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. It had been a habit since childhood, something her mother taught her when storms rolled in or when sadness hovered too long. The flame was a way of saying, "I'm still here. I still care." She sat on her old bed, the quilt faded and soft, sketchbook open on her lap. She drew from memory, her mother's hands braiding her hair, her father sanding wood in the garage, a quiet dinner table, with no words but plenty of presence. The next morning, she opened the laundry room and found boxes stacked against the wall. She shifted through them, curious, until one caught her eye. An old shoebox wrapped in faded newspaper. Inside were photos, most of her mother, some of Lena as a child. At the bottom, tucked between pages of a church bulletin, she found it. A wallet. Cracked leather. Her father's. She opened it gently, expecting it to be empty. Instead, behind the old ID card, she found a folded photo. A girl, maybe 7, beaming at the camera with paint-streaked cheeks and a crooked homemade necklace around her neck. It was Lena. Lena stared at the photo. Her breath caught in her throat. She remembered that day, the art fair at school. She had spent all week making that necklace for her father. He hadn't come to the fair, but she'd left the necklace on his workbench anyway. She thought he'd thrown it away. Now, decades later, she was looking at proof that he hadn't. He'd kept the picture, her picture, all this time. Her hand trembled as she returned the wallet to the box. She pressed the photo to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, she made stew with roasted squash and sage, and her father ate quietly, his spoon scraping the bowl. As she cleared the dishes, he reached out and tapped her hand once. "Your mother used to make it like that," he said. It was the most he had said in weeks. Lena smiled, not wide but deep. She nodded, not trusting her voice. After he went to bed, she sat alone on the porch, listening to the creak of the rocker. It moved gently in the night breeze, steady like a slowed heartbeat. A sound she once feared had become oddly comforting. It sounded like he was still here. The next morning, Lena found him sitting by the window, watching the wind sweep through the trees. His blanket had slipped off his lap. She bent to cover him again, and he didn't flinch or move away. If anything, his shoulders eased. She brought him a cup of coffee, weak just the way he liked it now, and sat across from him in the armchair that used to belong to her mother. They didn't talk. The silence between them had grown more familiar, less sharp. She picked up a basket of laundry and began folding as he dozed off. Every now and then, she caught herself glancing at him, searching for some sign that he knew she was still trying, that he saw her. In the afternoon, she returned to the garden. This time, she brought gloves and a spade. She began clearing the weeds from around the lavender, uncovering bits of her childhood with each clump of soil she turned. A marble, a tiny toy car, a rusted earring. She worked until the sun dipped low, her hands dirty and her knees sore, but the garden began to take shape again. So did something inside her. That evening, she brought out a photo album she had rescued from the attic. Its cover was cracked, the pages slightly warped from age. She placed it on the coffee table in front of him. He didn't say anything at first, but after a long silence, he reached for it and opened the first page. There they were. Images frozen in time. Her mother holding Lena as a baby. Her father at the river with a fishing rod. Lena's 6th birthday with a chocolate-smeared face and a handmade paper crown. His finger paused on one photo, a young Lena holding up a sign that said, "Look at me," in crayon. He let out the faintest chuckle. Then he said, "You always were a firecracker." Lena smiled through tears. They turned the pages together in silence, page after page of memories neither had spoken of in years. There were no grand confessions, just the quiet recognition of what had been and what could still be shared. That night, she tucked a fresh lavender bundle beneath his pillow. He didn't say anything, but he didn't move it either. And that, too, was something. Before bed, Lena checked the thermostat, turned off the porch light, and made sure her father's room was warm enough. The routines had become grounding, little acts of care, moments of meaning without ceremony. As she turned down the hallway, she noticed his bedroom door slightly ajar again. This time, a sliver of lamplight spilled into the hallway. She paused outside his door. Inside, her father sat at the edge of the bed, staring at something in his hand. She couldn't see what it was, but his shoulders were trembling. Whether from emotion or illness, she didn't know. She didn't enter. She simply placed her palm flat against the doorframe and whispered, "Good night, Dad." A pause. Then came his voice, hoarse, gravelly, but unmistakably clear. "Night, kiddo." It was the first time he'd called her that in years. She went to her room, heart full and aching, and curled up under the old quilt. The wind howled softly outside, but inside the house had changed. Not in noise or color, but in presence. Love wasn't loud. Sometimes it was hidden in old photos, forgotten gardens, and words said just once, but said in time. Lena hadn't ventured far from the house since arriving. Most days were spent cleaning, cooking, or simply sitting beside her father while he rested. But on a cloudy Thursday morning, she drove into town for supplies. The list was short: eggs, milk, batteries, but it felt like a pilgrimage, a chance to breathe different air, to feel like someone other than a caregiver for an hour. At the small-town grocery store, a place with faded linoleum floors and hand-painted signs, the clerk at the counter smiled warmly as Lena approached with her basket. "Back in town, huh?" the woman said. Her name tag read Marcy. She looked about 60, hair pulled back in a red scarf. Lena nodded. "Just for a while, taking care of my dad." Marcy's eyes softened. "He's lucky to have you. Not many folks stick around when things get hard. But at least the garden didn't die." Lena blinked. "The garden?" Marcy began bagging the items. "Yeah, the one behind the house. Thought maybe you were sending someone to keep it up. That man, what's his name? Quiet fella with the dog. Been tending to the lavender and squash all summer." Lena froze. "What man?" Marcy tapped her chin. "Lives down the road, past the bend, near the old willow tree. Has a cabin out there. Keeps to himself mostly. But ever since your dad got sick, he's been by every week. Pulling weeds, watering, even left a basket of tomatoes one time." Lena's mind raced. Her father hadn't mentioned anyone. He rarely mentioned anything at all, but this was different. She drove home slowly, groceries forgotten in the passenger seat. After setting everything down inside, she walked the narrow gravel path leading toward the edge of the property. Past the field, through the thicket of juniper, beyond the creek that barely trickled anymore. It was the kind of walk you didn't take unless you knew where you were going. And she didn't. But eventually she saw it. A modest cabin tucked beneath the arms of an old willow. A small wooden porch. Wind chimes hanging by the door, swaying in the light breeze. A dog barked once, then trotted out to greet her. An aging mutt with kind eyes and a slow tail wag. The front door opened. And there, standing in the frame with a mug in his hand and quiet eyes, was Keanu Reeves. He looked just like the films, only older, gentler. His hair was streaked with gray, his beard peppered with silver. But there was something about the way he stood, calm and still, that felt grounded. Real. Lena took a hesitant step forward. "Hi, I'm Lena. You've been taking care of my father's garden." Keanu nodded once. "Yeah." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Just looked at her with those deep, quiet eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you," she added, feeling the weight of the silence. "I didn't know. No one told me." Keanu glanced past her, toward the hills that cradled the horizon. "He helped me once," he said, voice low but steady. "A long time ago." Lena frowned. "My father? Really?" Another nod. "Years back. Car trouble on the road. I was passing through. He didn't say much, just handed me a jug of water and waited while I got it started. Didn't ask for anything, just nodded and walked away." Lena tried to imagine it. Her father, gruff and reserved, showing up for a stranger. She wanted to believe it. Keanu took a sip from his mug. "I figured I owed him." Lena shifted on her feet. "I'm not sure he even remembers that." Keanu offered the faintest smile. "Doesn't matter. Some things you do because they stay with you, even if no one else sees." The wind chimes tinkled gently behind him. The dog sat at Lena's feet now, leaning into her leg. She looked down, running her hand across the dog's back. "What's his name?" "Wally," Keanu said, "short for Wallace. He showed up one winter and never left. Lena smiled. Seems to be a theme around here. Keanu chuckled quietly, then stepped aside. Want some tea? She hesitated, then nodded and followed him inside. The cabin was simple. Books stacked against the walls, a fireplace with a kettle hanging over dying embers, and a worn couch covered in woven blankets. It smelled like cedar, tea leaves, and faint tobacco, nostalgic in a way she couldn't quite place. Keanu poured her a mug without asking what kind. She took it, sipped, and let the silence stretch comfortably between them. "You're welcome to visit again," he said finally. She looked at him, surprised. "If you ever need anything, or just want quiet," he added. Lena nodded slowly. "I think I might." On her walk home, Lena kept thinking about Keanu's words, about owing someone not for recognition, but because it stayed with you. It unsettled her in a strange way. She had spent her whole life trying to be seen by her father, and here was a man who showed up for him without ever needing to be seen in return. Back at the house, she stood at the garden's edge. The soil was freshly turned. The squash plants were still climbing the trellis her mother built. And tucked beneath a lavender bush, she saw a small, smooth stone with a feather etched into it. It hadn't been there yesterday. She picked it up, brushing the dirt from its surface, and smiled. That evening, she brought out her carving tools and sat on the porch. Her father was asleep in the rocker beside her, wrapped in a thick quilt. She worked quietly, the sun dipping low behind the hills. Hours passed, and when she was finished, she held in her hands a delicate silver pendant shaped like a feather. The next morning, she placed it in a small box, tied with leather cord, and headed back toward the willow tree. The cabin looked the same, peaceful and unmoved by time. Lena knocked once, and Keanu answered almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting her. She held out the small box. "For you, a thank you." He took it gently, untying the cord and opening it in his hands. When he saw the pendant, his face changed. Not dramatically, but in the subtle way someone's soul shifts. He looked up at her with a warmth that words couldn't reach. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "I made it last night," she replied. "I wasn't sure if you liked things like that." "I do," he said, "especially when they mean something." Lena hesitated, then asked the question that had been tugging at her since their first meeting. "Why didn't you say anything to him? My father. All this time. You could have told me earlier." Keanu looked out past the trees, his voice soft. "Some people carry their wounds in silence. I figured if he ever needed me, he'd find the words. But I didn't need them. I just needed to return the kindness." They stood there for a moment, the breeze brushing past like a whisper. Then Keanu nodded once. "I'm here if you need anything." Lena didn't say much else that day. She walked home with a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks. That night, she sat beside her father as he watched a weathered western on the television, the volume low. Without thinking, she placed the silver feather on the table beside his rocker. He glanced at it, picked it up slowly, ran his fingers over the grooves. Lena didn't expect him to say anything, but after a few moments he said, "You still carve." She froze, then nodded. "I never stopped." A long pause stretched between them. "It's good work," he said. Lena swallowed a lump in her throat. "Thanks." They sat together in that silence, the kind that didn't hurt as much anymore. Something had shifted. She didn't know what it meant yet or where it would lead, but for the first time in years, her father saw something she had made and called it good. Down the road, wind chimes whispered through the evening air, and inside a quiet cabin, a silver feather hung in the window, catching the last light of the day, watched perhaps by a man who believed in returning grace without needing applause. Lena stood at her workbench late into the evening. The silver feather pendant had opened a door, a small one, but enough to let light through. She wanted to offer something more this time, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. Because someone had seen her father when she no longer could, and that mattered. She opened a small velvet pouch and sifted through her materials. Turquoise beads, smoothed by time. A sliver of bone she had carved into a sun shape. Fine silver wire, her favorite. Her fingers moved with instinct, bending metal, threading memory into form. The process wasn't fast, but it was sacred. She remembered her grandmother once saying, "Jewelry carries more than stones. It carries the breath of the maker." By dawn, it was finished. The necklace was simple, elegant, turquoise stones balanced by the pale boned sun in the center. It had weight, but not heaviness. It was something meant to be worn in silence and understood without words. She wrapped it in deerskin and tied it with braided leather. Then she made the walk again, past the creek, beneath the willow tree, where the wind chimes whispered like ancestors in prayer. Keanu was already outside when she arrived, seated on the porch with a mug in hand. Wally, the old mutt, gave a quiet bark and wagged his tail, announcing her presence before she could speak. "I brought something," Lena said, her voice soft as she approached. Keanu looked up, and for a moment there was something childlike in his eyes, something open and unguarded. She handed him the wrapped gift. He untied the cord slowly, with care, the way someone unfolds a letter written in grief. When he saw the necklace, his breath hitched. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's yours," Lena replied. "Turquoise, for strength. Bone, for memory." He turned the piece in his hand, studying the carved sun at the center. "You made this?" Lena nodded. Keanu held it like it might break. Then, without ceremony, he slipped it over his head. The turquoise beads sat against the fabric of his shirt, glowing faintly in the morning light. "Would you like some tea?" he asked. Lena smiled. "I'd love that." Inside, the cabin was warm with the scent of steeping herbs and cedar smoke. Keanu poured her a mug and gestured toward the table, where 2 chairs waited without expectation. They sat without speaking for several minutes, sipping tea. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt like a kind of reverence, as though speaking too soon would break something delicate that was still forming between them. Keanu glanced at the necklace once more before setting his mug down. "You know, my mother used to wear turquoise," he said, voice just above a whisper. "Not for style, for grounding. She believed it protected the heart." Lena's fingers wrapped around her own cup. "Did you lose her recently?" He shook his head. "Years ago, but it doesn't really matter. Time stretches differently when you lose someone without saying what mattered." She nodded gently, knowing the feeling too well. "I wasn't there when she passed," he continued, "filming out of the country. By the time I came back, she was already gone. No note, no words, just a house filled with her scent and silence." Lena blinked slowly, throat tightening. "She didn't need flowers," Keanu said. "She needed someone to be still with her, to sit and just be." Lena looked down, her voice catching slightly. "My father never danced with me." Keanu looked over. "Not once. Not once." Lena smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "At every gathering, I'd ask. During the winter powwow, at the summer stomp dance. He'd just look away or say he was tired. I thought maybe if I crafted the best regalia or learned the old steps perfectly, he'd say yes." Keanu swirled the tea in his mug. "And did he ever say why?" "No," Lena said, and I stopped asking. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the willow branches like a lullaby too shy to sing aloud. Keanu leaned back in his chair. "I think sometimes we miss our chance to make the right memory. So we carry the wrong ones like armor." Lena studied him. "Is that why you live out here?" His eyes drifted toward the window. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just learning how to stop running." He turned back to her. "But you still have time." Lena's brows furrowed. "Time for what?" Keanu tilted his head. "To make a new dance, one that doesn't need music." She sat with that for a while, and in her heart something broke open. Not in pain, but in invitation. That evening, Lena sat on her porch alone, the carved feather necklace gently pressed between her fingers. Her father was inside, asleep early again. The weight of his breaths came slow and shallow now. It was hard to know how many nights like this remained. She watched the moon rise behind the hills, shadows dancing across the yard where she used to run barefoot as a child. Her mind returned to Keanu's words. About stillness, about memories waiting to be remade. She imagined the backyard with string lights hanging between the porch beams, a radio playing something soft, her father in his rocker, wrapped in the quilt her mother made, and her beside him. No music, no steps, just presence. A dance that didn't need movement. The image brought tears to her eyes, but it also steadied her. She wiped her cheeks, stood, and stepped back into the house. In the hallway closet, she found the old spool of lights, still tangled, still dusty, but still there. She carried them out gently and began untangling each strand, like knots in a story waiting to be rewritten. The dance wasn't lost. Not yet. The next morning, Lena returned to the cabin, this time with purpose. She brought 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, steam rising into the crisp air. Keanu opened the door with a faint smile, stepping aside to let her in without a word. She set the mugs down on the table and spoke plainly. "I'm going to do it." He didn't need to ask what she meant, he just nodded. "I don't know if he'll understand," she added, "or if he'll even be awake, but I want to give him something, one memory that doesn't feel unfinished." Keanu stirred his coffee. "That's all any of us really want." Lena looked up. "Would you come?" He blinked, surprised. "Not for him, for me," she said. "Just to be there." Keanu nodded again. "Of course." They spent the next hour stringing bulbs onto a thin line of twine. He helped test each socket, his hand steady with familiarity. When they were done, Lena packed the lights carefully into a crate and thanked him with a touch on his shoulder. She was ready, not for closure, not for peace, but for presence. And that would be enough. That evening, just before dusk, Lena stepped onto the porch and began stringing the lights. She moved slowly, deliberately, securing each end to the posts, letting the bulbs drape like stars waiting to rise. She swept the porch, laid out 2 chairs, and lit a small candle near the railing. Then she returned inside and found her father awake, watching her from his bed. His eyes followed her, but didn't question. "I'd like to sit with you outside for a bit," Lena said gently. He didn't speak, but after a moment he nodded. She helped him into his sweater, guided his frail frame out to the porch, and settled him into the rocker. He sat quietly, gazing out toward the trees. Keanu watched from the edge of the woods, far enough to be unseen, close enough to witness. Lena sat beside her father, not saying a word. She took his hand. A breeze passed through the lights above them. A faint melody played from a small radio inside the house. They didn't move. They didn't need to. In that stillness, they danced. And for the first time, Lena felt seen, and so did he. Later that night, after her father had been helped back to bed, Lena sat alone under the lights. The candle still flickered beside her, its flame small but steady. She stared at her hands, the ones that had crafted so many things in silence. For the first time, they felt like they had created something truly whole. Footsteps approached softly. Keanu stepped into the yard, carrying a folded blanket. "I figured it might get cold," he said. She took it and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you." He looked up at the lights. "You made something beautiful tonight." "I didn't think he'd let me," Lena whispered. "Hell didn't need to let you," Keanu said. "You just needed to show up." They stood in silence for a while. Before he left, he touched the turquoise necklace resting on his chest. "This will always remind me of what you gave back tonight." "And what's that?" she asked. A moment that didn't need fixing. Lena watched him go, her eyes wet but clear. She turned back to the porch and smiled, because love had spoken, without needing to say a word. The morning after the silent evening on the porch, Lena rose with the sun. Her father was still asleep, his breath shallow but steady beneath the patchwork quilt she had tucked around him the night before. She stood by the doorway, staring a moment longer than usual, then turned and padded quietly down the hall. The porch was cool under her bare feet. The wind had settled. The string lights she'd strung across the eaves still twinkled faintly in the dawn. The record player sat tucked beside a folded blanket. The garden, once neglected and dry, now looked touched, tended not just by her hands, but by time itself. Slowly, without fanfare, things were starting to shift. That day, Lena decided to clean the attic. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of light that pierced the slats near the roof. Boxes were stacked in odd shapes, labeled Christmas. Tools, photos. She worked methodically, lifting one lid at a time, sorting memories by scent and shape. Then, near the far wall, she spotted a worn cardboard box with the word "Dad's" scribbled faintly in pencil. Inside, beneath a folded army blanket and a tangle of old extension cords, lay a record player. The wood was chipped, the needle bent, but it worked. Her breath caught when she tested it. Beneath the player, stacked with quiet reverence, was a collection of vinyl records. Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, Patsy Cline. Songs that had once echoed through their house like distant thunder. She remembered being small, dancing barefoot to those melodies. Her father in his rocker, her mother singing under her breath. It had been years. That evening, Lena cooked a simple dinner: beans, cornbread, and tea. She helped her father out to the porch, his steps slower, his weight heavier. He didn't ask questions, just nodded when she settled him into his chair. She placed the record on the player. The soft static gave way to melody, warm and raw and honest. They sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to mauve. Halfway through the second song, she made a joke about turning their porch into a honky-tonk and charging the dear rent for standing in the yard. It wasn't her best material, but something about it landed. Her father chuckled. It was brief, rough, but unmistakably real. Lena froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She glanced sideways. He hadn't looked at her, but the smile was there, tugging at the corner of his mouth, like it had forgotten how to form, but remembered just in time. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She let the moment pass like wind through dry leaves. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe he's still in there." The next morning, her father was already sitting up when she came in to check on him. She made coffee and toast. He took the cup in both hands, steady. He cleared his throat. That honky-tonk line. She braced. "It was stupid," he said. "A beat. But funny." Lena laughed. It surprised even her. Later, she returned to the attic, compelled to search deeper. She found another box, this one older, the tape brittle on the sides. Inside was a birthday card she had made when she was 9. Folded construction paper, a drawing of her and her father under a rainbow. "You're my hero," it said in blocky letters. Underneath, an arrowhead she had given him after her first hike, and a photo. Her in regalia, face painted, proud. All these years she had believed he didn't see her, didn't keep anything. But he had. She brought the box down and placed it gently on the table between them that afternoon. He stared at it, then reached inside. For a long time he said nothing. Then his fingers touched the card. "You gave this to me after I missed your recital." "I remember." I didn't know what to say. "You didn't have to," she replied, her voice soft. He lifted the photo. "Your mom made that dress." Lena nodded. "She was up sewing all night. Sheem always said you had her hands." They sat in silence, but now it wasn't the absence of words that defined the moment. It was the presence of everything they hadn't said before. She turned on the record player again. He leaned back, eyes closed, as the music wrapped around them. That night, Lena didn't cry. She smiled, not because everything was healed, but because something had begun. The next morning, as they sipped coffee on the porch, her father stared into the distance and said, "Thanks for staying." She placed her hand gently over his. "I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. That evening, she added more lights to the backyard. Not for an occasion, just in case. As the sun dipped and the crickets began their chorus, her father rested in the rocker again. The music played low, and just as the first stars appeared, he turned to her. "You know, your mother used to hum this one." Lena smiled. "I remember. She'd braid your hair, sing to the dog when she thought no one was listening." "She had a beautiful voice," Lena whispered. Her father nodded, slow. "She did." And then he looked at her. Really looked. "I'm glad you came home." Lena met his eyes. "So am I." The porch light glowed warm, the music swayed, and in the quiet stillness of a place once ruled by silence, a smile lived between them. The first, but not the last. The days fell into a rhythm neither Lena nor her father acknowledged out loud. Mornings began with the soft clink of mugs in the kitchen, her father's slow shuffle from bed to chair, and the unmistakable scent of strong coffee. Lena would prepare a simple breakfast, sometimes toast, sometimes oatmeal, and they'd eat together, mostly in silence, sometimes with the local news humming in the background. His illness didn't move in dramatic waves, but slow tides. Some days steadier, others riddled with pain that lingered behind his eyes. Lena learned to read the tilt of his head, the arch of his brow, the way his hands tensed slightly when the pain crept too close. She adjusted the medication schedule, sat with him through the hard spells, and offered water or cool towels without needing to be asked. They rarely spoke of what was coming. Neither one had the appetite for that kind of honesty. But there were small things. A nod, a muttered thanks, a shared glance at an old photo on the wall that spoke louder than grief ever could. In the afternoons, they'd sit on the porch and watch the breeze bend through the trees. Occasionally, Lena would turn the record player on low. Her father never requested a song, but he never asked her to turn it off either. It became their quiet soundtrack, notes floating like ghosts through the warm afternoon air. At dinner, Lena made stew. It was one of the few dishes her father had taught her, though she never remembered him praising it before. That night, as she set the bowl in front of him, he took one bite, chewed slowly, and said, "You make good stew." That was it. Just 5 words. But they hit her like thunder. She turned her face slightly so he wouldn't see her eyes well up. It wasn't just about the stew. It was about being seen, recognized. She swallowed her emotions, nodded, and said, "Thanks." After dinner, they sat on the porch again, side by side. The air was crisp, the sky clear. Stars began to pepper the night like pinholes in dark velvet. He sipped his tea, she sipped hers. And then he said quietly, "Your mother would have liked tonight." Lena didn't speak. She just reached over, laid her hand on his. That was the conversation. They fell into their routine like it had always existed. Lena cleaned in the mornings, ran errands in the afternoons, and made sure his medicine was taken with precision. Her father, though still weak, insisted on folding the laundry or rinsing dishes, his stubbornness flaring in brief sparks. She let him have those victories. One day she found him standing by the garden hose, staring down at the dry patches she'd been working to bring back to life. "You planted sunflowers," he muttered. "They'll come in crooked this time of year." Lena smiled. "Like my drum." He looked at her then, really looked. "Didn't say it back then," he said, "but I was proud of that drum." It was one of those statements that came out without warning, unburdened by eye contact or ceremony. He turned and walked inside before she could reply. But Lena didn't need to. She knelt by the patch of crooked sunflowers, letting her fingers trace the rough soil, and she smiled to herself. It was these moments, brief, offhand, deeply rooted, that made the days more than just waiting. They were becoming something else, something almost whole. One afternoon, Lena brought out a deck of old cards and set them on the porch table. Her father raised an eyebrow. "You still cheat at gin?" he asked, deadpan. Only when I need to win, she replied with a grin. They played 2 rounds. He won both. She accused him of stacking the deck, and he didn't deny it. The laughter that followed was quiet but full. When the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat back and listened to the chirping of cicadas. She thought about all the birthdays he'd forgotten, all the school projects he never asked about, all the dances where she'd waited for him to show up and he never did. But sitting there, watching the sky turn shades of violet and fire, she didn't feel bitterness. She felt his presence. That night, while helping him into bed, he paused at the door. "You've got strong hands," he said, his voice low. "Like your mother." Lena smiled, the tears stinging but welcome. "She taught me well." He nodded, settled onto the mattress, and closed his eyes. "Night, Dad," she whispered. "Night, girl," he murmured back. And that was enough. Over the next few days, Lena noticed something new in their routine. Not words, but gestures. Her father began waiting by the door when she came back from town, his silhouette visible through the curtain. He'd sit outside before she did, tea in hand, rocking quietly as if saving a seat beside him. He didn't ask questions, didn't initiate conversation, but he waited. Once, she came home carrying a bundle of sage. As she passed him, he said, "Your grandmother used to hang that above the door." Lena stopped in her tracks. He'd never spoken of her grandmother, not even at the funeral. "That's where I learned it," Lena said, her voice soft. He nodded. "Good woman. Tougher than anyone." The words floated between them. Not warm, not cold, just true. Lena realized then that her father wasn't avoiding the past. He was protecting it, in his own brittle way. She lit the sage that night and let it smolder through the house. Her father didn't protest. He just inhaled once, eyes closed, and whispered, "Smells like Sunday." And it did. In those ashes and smoke, something long buried stirred again. It smelled like memory. One evening, as Lena brought dinner out to the porch, she found her father already there, blanket over his legs, watching the horizon. She placed the bowl of stew in front of him and sat down beside him with her own. They ate slowly, rhythmically, the sound of spoons tapping bowls like background music to a moment neither of them would name. Halfway through his bowl, he said, "You didn't have to come back." Lena lowered her spoon. "I know." He didn't look at her. "But you did." "I wanted to," she said. "I still do." He was silent for a long time. Then softly he added, "I thought I'd be alone." "You're not," she replied. The stars began to appear, one by one, like cautious messengers. "I wasn't much of a father," he muttered. She turned to him, heart full but steady. "You were there. That counts." He met her eyes then. There was no grand apology, no tears, just a moment of clarity, a thread mended, however fragile. They sat there for hours, 2 shadows under a darkening sky. It was the closest thing to peace they'd ever shared. The days grew shorter and the wind grew cooler. Lena added another blanket to her father's chair, knit by her mother years ago. The edges were frayed, but he pulled it over his lap without a word. One morning he asked her to make pancakes, something he hadn't done since she was a child. She made them golden brown with extra butter, just like she remembered. He ate 2, then leaned back and sighed. "Tastes like childhood," he said. Lena smiled. "The good parts?" He looked at her, eyes glinting with something too deep to name. "The best." She didn't ask for more. That afternoon, they listened to the record player again. Her father tapped his fingers on the armrest, faintly keeping time. "You ever dance?" he asked out of nowhere. Lena raised an eyebrow. "Not much." He grunted. "Neither did I." They chuckled, but she could feel the heaviness behind it. Not regret. Something softer. Maybe longing. That night, as she closed his bedroom door behind her, she whispered into the dark, "I wish you had." She didn't know he heard her. But the next morning, his record was already playing when she stepped outside. It was playing softly, an old country tune with a gentle rhythm. Her father sat in the rocker, eyes closed, feet tapping faintly. Lena didn't speak. She sat beside him, took her tea, and let the music do what words never could. He reached out, slow and shaking, and placed his hand over hers. Neither of them looked away. The porch light flickered on as dusk fell. Crickets began their evening chorus. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, like a memory trying to be heard. "You're a good woman," he said, voice like gravel and wind. Lena blinked hard, then leaned her head against his shoulder. In that fragile twilight, under a sky both of them had stared at through decades of silence, they stayed still. No explanations, no old wounds reopened, no need. Just two people, father and daughter, sharing something that felt, at last, like love. She squeezed his hand gently, and he didn't let go. Not that night. Not ever again. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the clouds seemed stitched together like an old quilt, heavy, comforting, and reluctant to rain. Lena was stacking firewood beside the porch when she noticed a familiar figure walking up the dirt path. It was Keanu, flannel sleeves rolled, carrying a bundle of wood tied neatly with thick rope. She straightened and dusted off her hands. "You didn't have to do that," she said as he approached. Keanu gave a small smile, eyes kind and quiet. "Figured you'd need it before the next cold snap." He set the wood down near the steps without waiting for her to move. He was like that, gentle in presence, firm in gesture. Lena watched him for a moment, unsure whether to offer small talk or just a nod of thanks. "Come in for coffee?" she asked finally. He looked up. "Sure." Inside, the house was warm, dimly lit, and humming with the scent of cinnamon tea. She poured 2 mugs and motioned to the kitchen table. They sat across from each other, steam rising in silent curls. For a while, they didn't speak. Then Keanu broke the stillness. "You ever have something you meant to say, but never did?" Lena nodded slowly. "Most of my life." Keanu stared into his mug. "I had a friend. Good guy, tough as iron. Always thought he had time." He didn't say the friend's name, and Lena didn't ask. His voice carried the weight of someone walking through old memories, deliberate, reverent. Haley used to talk about his dad like he was a giant, said he'd never seen the man cry, not once, said he was the kind of guy who gave advice by fixing things in silence. You know the type. Lena smiled faintly. "Yeah, I do." Keanu nodded. "Anyway, the old man had a stroke. Sudden, no warning. Gone in 3 days." His fingers wrapped tighter around the mug. "My friend didn't make it in time. Missed the last flight out. Got stuck in weather, and when he finally made it, all he could do was stand there, at the edge of a hospital bed. No voice, no heartbeat, nothing left to say. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with meaning." Keanu leaned back in the chair. "He told me once, regret isn't loud, it just echoes. I never forgot that." Lena looked down at the table, her eyes misting. "That's what I'm afraid of." Keanu met her gaze. "Then don't be. Make something now, even if it's small, even if it feels silly." She hesitated. "Like what?" He tilted his head, the corner of his mouth tugging up. "If you were going to choreograph a goodbye, what would it look like?" Lena let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting years. "I don't know, I guess. I'd want him to see me. Just once. Really see me." Keanu's eyes softened. "Then don't wait for the moment. Make one." She didn't answer right away. But something shifted in her posture, a decision forming, like dawn behind her ribs. Keanu stood, gently pushed in his chair, and picked up his empty mug. "I should get back before it gets dark." Lena followed him to the door. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He nodded. "You're welcome." And then, just before he stepped off the porch, he turned back. "Lena," he said, "whatever you create, don't worry about making it perfect. Just make it honest." Then he was gone, swallowed by the gray of the path, the wind, and the waiting dusk. That night, Lena lay awake in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung after all these years. Keanu's words echoed in her chest. What would a goodbye look like? She thought of every gathering her father had missed, every dance he never led her to, every time she longed for him to notice the beadwork around her neck, or the courage it took to speak up. But what would it mean now? To be seen. She imagined soft light. Her father in his rocker. No speeches, no ceremonies. Just presence. Just a moment that said, "I was here. You mattered to me." She got up and found her old sketch pad in the closet. The pages were yellowed, the edges curled. She flipped past drawings of feathers, bead patterns, her dog from 5th grade, until she found a blank page. She began to draw. A string of lights, a rocking chair, her father's silhouette, and her kneeling beside him, one hand in his, music dancing on invisible wind. She didn't know if it would happen, but something in her believed it could. Not because he would suddenly change, but because she had. And that was enough to begin. The next morning, Lena stepped into the backyard with new eyes. The sun had just started rising, streaking the sky with colors she hadn't noticed in weeks. She walked to the tree line, her boots crunching softly against frostbitten grass, and looked out over the space that had once held cookouts and cornhole games, back when things were simpler. Or maybe just louder. She pulled out a notepad and began listing what she'd need. Rope lights, an extension cord, her father's favorite chair, the old radio that still played if you kicked it in the right spot. The idea wasn't about closure anymore. It was about offering something unspoken. Her version of "I love you," made with hands and silence. That afternoon, she returned to Keanu's cabin. He answered the door with a towel slung over his shoulder, midway through sanding a wooden shelf. "I want to do it," Lena said, breathless from her walk. "The goodbye." He didn't blink. "Then let's make it happen." They spent the next few hours weaving lights through tree branches, testing the radio's scratchy signal, and dusting off the rocking chair like it was a throne. Keanu didn't ask what she wanted him to say or do. He just helped, quiet as always. When it was done, Lena stepped back, eyes misty. The backyard glowed with amber light. The wind was calm. The chair faced west, where the last light of the day dipped below the trees. Keanu turned to leave, pausing only to place a hand briefly on Lena's shoulder. "You've done more than most ever get the chance to," he said. "Now go dance." As she walked toward the house, her father stood just inside the screen door. He looked out at the lights, the chair, the old radio sitting on a stool, humming something faint and familiar. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. That evening, as the stars began to pierce the sky, Lena led him out slowly, one hand steady at his elbow. He sank into the chair. She knelt beside him. The music played, and without moving a single step, they danced. They didn't speak as the music drifted across the yard, blending with the sound of wind moving through pine. Lena's fingers laced gently with his, resting on the arm of the rocking chair. Her father's eyes were half closed, not from pain, but from peace. For once he wasn't guarded. He wasn't somewhere else. He was right there, with her. When the song ended, she reached over and turned the knob, letting the quiet settle again like dust in old sunlight. He looked at her then, not through her, not around her, but at her. His lips parted, barely moving. "You did good, kid." It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't erase years. But it landed like a stone in still water, crippling everything that came before. Lena nodded, swallowing back the tears. "I'm glad you saw it." He chuckled softly. "I never missed it." They sat there until the stars brightened into full constellations, until the moon climbed high and the crickets took over where the music left off. Eventually Lena stood, kissed the top of his head, and went inside. Keanu watched from his porch down the road, tea in hand, heart full, eyes shining. Sometimes the quiet ones write the loudest goodbyes. Later that night, Lena wrote just one line in her journal. "I was seen." No footnotes, no explanations. Just a truth she had waited her whole life to feel. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, how many days were left, or whether her father would remember every detail. But in that moment, under those stars, with the echo of a song and the warmth of a hand in hers, she had finally choreographed the goodbye she'd needed all along. And she hadn't done it alone. Down the road, in a cabin lit by a single lamp, Keanu Reeves placed the necklace she'd given him gently on the windowsill. It caught the starlight, glinting faintly. A thank you for something beyond words. A reminder that love doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it just comes when we dare to try one more time. And for the first time in years, Lena finally felt like she belonged, in his story and in her own. The next morning brought a strange stillness to the house, like it was holding its breath. Lena moved through the kitchen slowly, making tea, the soft clink of the spoon against ceramic louder than usual. Her father sat on the porch, wrapped in his wool blanket, eyes on the trees but unfocused. The air had cooled again, promising a colder night. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't show it. That had always been the question. What did he feel but never say? Lena turned back inside. Today she had a plan. It was time. Not for closure, not for answers, but for presence. For a goodbye that didn't need words. She started by unboxing the string lights she'd bought from town the week before. A mix of amber bulbs and tiny stars. Nothing fancy, just warm and simple. She took them outside, dragging a ladder from the garage and propping it under the tree where she used to hang paper lanterns during childhood birthdays. One by one, she strung the lights through branches. Each bulb flickered as it connected, forming a soft canopy above the space near the porch. She cleared the leaves from the ground with a wide push broom, revealing the stone path underneath. The familiar crack between two flagstones made her smile. It had once been the finish line in races she ran alone, pretending someone was cheering at the other end. In the corner of the yard sat the old speaker. It hadn't worked in years, but Keanu had stopped by earlier in the week to fix it without being asked, just like always. Lena plugged it in and was stunned to hear the soft hum of life. She dusted off a vinyl copy of her father's favorite record, something with old pedal steel and a slow drawl, and gently set the needle. It crackled. Then music spilled out, soft, slow, heavy with memory. Lena stepped back and looked around. The lights above glowed against the rising dusk. The speaker played quietly. A single chair waited beneath the canopy. She walked to the porch. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slightly. "I have something to show you." He didn't speak, but he let her take his arm. She helped him into the rocker and wheeled it across the grass. The sky had shifted to twilight. A deep violet spread across the horizon, wrapping the yard in a hush only the desert knew how to keep. Lena positioned the rocker under the lights, adjusted the blanket on his shoulders, and knelt beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The music was enough. Her father's eyes flicked upward, toward the bulbs glowing like quiet stars, then back to her. His jaw tightened slightly, as if searching for a word he'd long forgotten. Lena reached out, gently placed her hand over his. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, soft, unsure, but present. The music played on, a slow, nostalgic track that had no need for lyrics, just steel strings and time. Lena stayed on her knees, not in submission, but in love, in memory, in reclamation. She rocked slightly, her hand still clasping his, her breath matching the rhythm of the chair. And there, without movement, they danced. Not with steps, not with turns, but with stillness. And in that stillness, something shattered quietly between them. Years of silence, years of distance, not erased, but softened. Not explained, but shared. Lena blinked slowly, tears gathering without falling. Her father's grip didn't tighten, but it didn't loosen either. She turned her head, resting her temple gently against his knuckles. The breeze caught a strand of her hair and lifted it like a banner. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. Crickets sang back up. The lights above twinkled faintly, casting shadows like fingerprints across the yard. Then it happened. A single tear traced a line down her father's cheek. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with words or sobs. But it was there, honest and undeniable. Lena felt it before she saw it. She looked up. He was already looking at her. And for the first time in her memory, he didn't look past her. He saw her. Not the little girl who built tools to win his approval. Not the teenager who left. Not the caretaker. Just Lena, his daughter. Her lip quivered. She didn't say, "I love you." She didn't need to. And he didn't say it back. But his hand moved. Barely, but enough. A small squeeze. A response. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. It was everything. Minutes passed like pages turning. Lena didn't want to move, afraid that the moment might crumble if she did. But the song ended. And another began. Her father closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in peace. She stayed by his side, hand still in his, until the last note faded. Later that night, after she had helped him back inside and tucked the blanket around his legs, she stepped back into the yard alone. The lights were still on. Keanu stood at the fence, hands in his pockets, watching quietly. Lena walked over, wiping her face. "And cried," she said softly, voice catching. "I know," Keanu replied, equally quiet. "He saw me." "Always did," Keanu said. "He just didn't know how to show it." They stood in silence. The wind carried the last bars of the music through the trees. Lena looked up at the stars, then back at the empty rocker. "I think that was our dance," she whispered. Keanu nodded once. It was beautiful. And with that he turned to go, leaving her in the glow of her own memory, held together by string lights and one long overdue goodbye. Back inside, Lena lit a candle on the kitchen counter and pulled out her journal. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to a fresh page. She wrote just one sentence. "Have danced with me." No embellishments, no explanations, just the truth of what had happened under those lights. She closed the journal, set it aside, and walked down the hall to her father's room. He was already asleep, the blanket tucked around him the same way she used to wrap her childhood dolls. She kissed his forehead, something she hadn't done since she was 10. Then she sat in the chair next to his bed and watched him breathe. Outside, the backyard lights swayed in the breeze, their glow visible through the slats of the blinds. In that quiet house, full of ghosts and silence and love too long buried, a daughter sat with her father, not waiting for a miracle, not asking for change, just being there. Together, that night, no dreams came. There was no need. The memory had already been made, and it would last. Not in photographs, not in words, but in the soft rhythm of two hearts finally beating in time. Lena woke early, the morning light thin and blue across her father's windowsill. As she moved quietly through the living room, she paused when she noticed something sitting beside his empty rocking chair. A cedar box. It hadn't been there the night before. She furrowed her brow. She hadn't seen it the night before. Her fingers hovered over the lid, hesitant. Something about it felt ceremonial. She looked toward the door, half expecting her father to call out to explain, but the house was silent. With a soft breath, she opened the box. Inside, folded in layers of old cotton and linen, was the headdress. Her headdress, the one she had made when she was 10. Her first real project, stitched by hand with every scrap of leather and bead she could gather. She had spent weeks on it. Tiny feathers she found herself, shells from the creek, bone beads she'd begged from the trading post. Her child hands had bled from the thread, but she had finished it, proud, wide-eyed, eager for him to see. He hadn't said much back then. A nod, a grunt, no smile. She had tucked the memory away like a stone in her pocket, and now here it was, untouched, perfectly preserved. Not in the attic, not thrown away, but kept, guarded. She blinked hard as she spotted a folded note tucked beneath it, her name written in shaky but firm letters, Lena. She unfolded the note slowly, afraid it might disintegrate under her trembling fingers. I was always proud, just didn't know how to say it. That was all. Lena sat down, the note clutched to her chest, her breath catching in her throat. All those years spent wondering, questioning, aching, melted in that moment. The child inside her, still waiting on that porch swing, finally heard the words she'd longed for. Tears welled in her eyes, not loud or heaving, but steady, like a stream that had found its path again. Her shoulders softened. The armor she didn't realize she still wore cracked at last. She sat there for a long time, the box on her lap, the headdress gleaming softly in the morning light, the note pressed to her heart like a seal. Eventually she stood and brought the box into the house, placing it carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. Then she walked back outside and headed for the garden, the one that had come back to life under her neighbor's quiet hands. She reached for the spade and began working, slow, steady movements in the damp soil, replanting marigolds, trimming basil, letting the earth hold her. Her hands, dirt-streaked and aching, worked through the rows of tomatoes. She didn't notice the figure approaching until a soft crunch of gravel reached her ears. Keanu stood at the edge of the garden. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He saw the tears on her cheeks, the soil on her hands, the silence blooming like wildflowers around her. He nodded once, deeply, respectfully. She nodded back. It was enough. Keanu stepped away, disappearing down the road as quietly as he'd come. Lena kept working, not to distract, not to avoid, but because her father had once said, "The earth remembers what you put into it." She dug deeper, planting more than vegetables, planting memories, forgiveness, a future. The sky turned bluer, the air warmed slightly, and in the stillness, Lena felt her father's presence. Not the man who never spoke, but the one who had saved that headdress, who had written that note, who had sat under the backyard lights and let his heart speak in silence. She whispered softly, "I heard you." And with that, she kept going. Hands steady, heart open, sun rising higher above the house, that now finally felt like home. Later that afternoon, Lena brought out a basin of warm water and gently washed her father's hands. He said nothing, but looked down at her with eyes a little softer than the day before. She dried his fingers with an old flannel cloth, the kind he used to wipe grease from his tools, and folded it on his lap. "Garden's coming back," she murmured, half to him, half to herself. He nodded faintly. The wind stirred the wind chimes again, soft, like breath through hollow bones. Inside, the record player still spun gently from last night's song. Lena watched the light filter through the lace curtains and wondered if her mother had once stood in this same place, wondering the same things. If she'd ever longed for words never spoken. If she, too, had relied on gestures instead of grand speeches. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Lena picked a few marigolds and tucked them in a vase by the headdress box. The note remained inside, folded neatly. Unspoken love had a voice now, and that voice was enough to carry forward everything that had ever gone unsaid. That night, Lena stepped out into the backyard once more. The string lights were still up, gently swaying, casting soft halos across the grass. The chair sat empty now, but not abandoned. She pulled her own beside it and sat down, resting her chin in her palm. The stars blinked above, old, wise, patient. She thought about everything that had been lost and everything that had returned. The silence was no longer hollow. It was full of years, of effort, of buried tenderness. A few minutes passed before she noticed a shape in the distance. Keanu, standing at the edge of his porch, arms crossed, just watching. She raised her hand slightly in acknowledgement. He did the same. It was the simplest kind of connection, a thread of understanding, thin but unbreakable. Tomorrow might bring more caretaking, more decline, more of the slow, inevitable goodbye, but tonight, Lena had what she needed. A note, a headdress, a single squeeze of a hand beneath the lights, and a father who, in his own way, had always seen her. She looked to the stars and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't for them. It was for herself. The next morning, Lena rose early and placed the headdress back in its cedar box. She added one more thing, an old bracelet she had worn since her teenage years, made from the same turquoise stones. Then she shut the lid and tied it with leather cord. She carried the box into her father's room and set it gently beside him. He stirred, eyes opening slowly. He didn't ask questions, he just looked at her. Their eyes met, and in that quiet gaze, everything passed between them. The years, the pain, the regret, and the forgiveness neither of them had ever said aloud. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered. He blinked once. That was enough. Later, while preparing soup, Lena heard the soft shuffle of feet on the porch. Keanu appeared at the screen door, holding a small stack of chopped wood. She opened the door, smiled, and took the bundle from his arms. "Thank you." "No need," he replied. But he didn't leave right away. He stepped inside, stood for a moment near the mantel, and looked up at the cedar box. He nodded again. That time, Lena nodded back, with something that felt like peace. Before he left, Keanu turned to her and said, "You gave him something real." Lena's throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice, so she simply nodded. After he left, she returned to the porch, sat down with a cup of warm tea, and watched the wind move gently through the garden beds. The scent of sage and tomatoes drifted in the air. She glanced at the chair next to hers, the one that creaked every time her father rocked, and smiled. There would be more hard days ahead, more caretaking, perhaps a final breath she couldn't stop, but that didn't matter now. They had danced, not with steps or music, but with heart, and she had seen him, and he, finally, had seen her. For the first time in her life, Lena felt whole. She closed her eyes and let the light hold her. Lena woke before dawn. At first it was the quiet that stirred her, a different kind of quiet, not the gentle hush of morning, but something stiller, something final. She pulled on her robe and walked down the hall, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The light outside was just beginning to soften the sky, blue giving way to the first brush of gold. The scent of cedar lingered faintly in the air. When she reached the door to her father's room, she paused. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She didn't need to knock. She already knew. Inside, he lay in the same position he had fallen asleep in, the blanket still pulled up to his chest, the cedar box still on the shelf. His hands rested gently on his stomach. There was no fear in his face, no struggle, only stillness. Lena's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't cry, not yet. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand in hers, cold now, but familiar, worn like the garden tools he used to carry, weathered by work and by time. She stayed like that until the light crept fully into the room. Later that morning, her aunt arrived. Lena met her at the front door with tired eyes and an embrace that lingered longer than words could hold. They made calls, arranged for the coroner, chose a modest cremation package. Her father's few possessions, his boots, his hats, his tools, were left untouched for now. The house carried a fragile quiet, like it was holding its breath with her. Neighbors came and went throughout the day, dropping off casseroles, loaves of bread, jugs of iced tea. They left with soft condolences, gentle hand squeezes, and eyes that spoke volumes. Some shared stories Lena had never heard. Her father helping someone build a fence, fixing a roof in the rain, showing up unasked with a jug of gas during a winter storm. "Well, does he say much?" one neighbor said, "but when he showed up, he always meant it." Lena smiled faintly. That sounded about right. In the late afternoon, she stepped outside to clear her head. The rocker sat empty on the porch, still facing the garden. The breeze was soft, brushing past the wind chimes. On the garden gate, Lena noticed a small bundle wrapped in cotton cloth, sage, wildflowers, and a single turquoise bead. Lena picked it up gently. There was no note, but she didn't need one. She knew it was from Keanu, a gesture quiet and powerful, his version of a eulogy. She held the bundle to her chest and breathed in the sage. That evening, after the guests had left and her aunt had gone to rest, Lena remained on the porch. She brought out the record player and placed a vinyl gently on the turntable. The soft crackle of the needle finding its groove filled the silence, followed by the familiar opening chords of her father's favorite song. She sat in his chair this time, the one that creaked beneath his weight, the one that now held the shape of memory. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, moonlight casting silver shadows across the lawn. Lena looked out and imagined him sitting beside her, quiet, steady, with that half-smile he gave her just once in the last week. She closed her eyes and let the music carry her. Not into grief, but into gratitude. They hadn't said everything, but they had said enough. Sometimes love didn't come in sentences. Sometimes it came in silence and stayed there forever. The next morning, Lena rose early, driven by something she couldn't name. She brewed a cup of coffee and walked the length of the garden rows. Some of the herbs were blooming again, lavender, mint, and sage, brushing her fingertips. She bent to pull a few weeds, but found herself still for a moment, just listening. Birdsong, wind, her own breath. She walked back to the porch and opened her sketch pad. Her hands moved on instinct, tracing the outline of a scene she'd lived the night before. Her father's chair, the garden, the dancing lights above the rocking porch. But this time, she drew a second chair beside his, and in that chair, she placed herself, smiling, at peace. It wasn't about the words. It never had been. It was about the space they held together, the invisible bond, born of years of misunderstanding, but held together now by presence and effort. A week later, the ashes arrived in a small cedar urn. Lena placed it on the mantel next to the headdress he'd preserved. Not to hold on, but to remember. That day, she returned to her workbench, and for the first time in weeks, she began to create again. Her hands moved slowly at first, unsure, but soon the rhythm returned. The smooth handling of beads, the braiding of thin leather cord, the gentle carving of bone. Each movement was like a whisper, a prayer. She'd crafted a single pendant. It wasn't elaborate, just a round disc carved from polished cedar, with a turquoise bead set in the center and a single word etched into the wood: seen. Later that afternoon, she walked down the road to Keanu's cabin. He was outside, stacking wood. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't ask questions. He just nodded once, then waited. She held out the pendant in her open hand. "For you," she said. "For helping me see him, and let him see me." Keanu accepted it with quiet reverence. "I think," he said slowly, "you helped him more than you'll ever know." They stood there in the evening light, the silence between them filled with meaning. Lena turned to walk back home, heart lighter than it had been in months. That night, she sat in her father's chair once more, the record spinning softly beside her, and whispered, "You saw me. I know that now." The following Sunday, the community held a small memorial service beneath the cottonwood trees near the river. Lena didn't prepare a speech. She didn't read anything aloud. She simply stood with her aunt and listened to the wind rustle the branches overhead, watching the light flicker through the leaves like memory itself. When the ceremony ended, someone asked if she would speak. She hesitated, then shook her head. Instead, she opened her hand and held up a small stone, smooth, hand-painted, with the same turquoise shade as the pendant she'd gifted Keanu. "This was his favorite color?" she said quietly. "He never told me that. I just new. Then she placed it by the water's edge, just where the current kissed the soil, and walked away. That night she took out her journal and wrote a final line before closing it for good. You were the song I didn't know I remembered. And in the quiet of the old house, with stars peeking gently through the curtains, she slept peacefully for the first time in a long while. Not because everything had been said, but because love, when it's real, doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. And in her dreams, he was there, smiling, silent, and finally at peace. Spring came slowly to the high desert. Snowmelt fed the thirsty ground, coaxing green from the dry earth. Lena stood on the porch one bright morning, her arms crossed as she looked out across the backyard. The rocker sat just where he'd left it, weathered, unmoving. The garden had begun to bloom again, sage, lavender, cornflowers. In her hand she held a small sapling. It was a gift from a neighbor, a young juniper tree, its roots wrapped in burlap, soil still damp from the nursery. She walked to the spot she had marked beside the porch and began to dig. The sun warmed her back as the soil gave way. When the hole was ready, she lowered the sapling gently, pressing the earth around it like tucking in a child. Once it was settled, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the turquoise necklace, the same one she had gifted Keanu, the one he had returned quietly a week after the funeral, with only a note that read, "It belongs here." She hung it carefully on one of the lower branches, where it swayed gently in the breeze. A quiet blessing, a marker of beginnings. Over the next few weeks, the tree grew taller, its branches reaching with quiet determination. Children walking home from school began to notice it. Some would pause to touch the hanging necklace. Others would sit in the grass beneath its shade. They began calling it the dancing tree, enchanted by how the turquoise bead would spin and shimmer in the light wind, like it held a secret. Lena began to hear the name whispered around town, in coffee shops and at the market. The dancing tree. It made her smile. He'd started teaching classes again, jewelry making at the local community center every Thursday afternoon. It was a modest class, mostly young girls and a few curious boys, each one learning how to knot leather, set stones, and shape wire with care. Lena brought her father's old tools and showed them how to listen to the material, to respect the tradition behind the craft. It wasn't about selling pieces anymore. It was about remembering, about honoring, and about offering something gentle to hands that had maybe only known harshness. Every week, she returned home with clay-stained fingers and a quieter heart. One afternoon, Lena arrived home early and found someone sitting beneath the tree, a small girl, no more than 8 or 9, with long, dark hair and a tear-streaked face. Her backpack was on the ground beside her, half unzipped. The child stared at the necklace, watching it spin like it held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. Lena didn't ask questions. She simply walked over and sat beside her, legs crossed in the tall grass. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. After a while, Lena said softly, "Sometimes we don't need words, just someone to sit with us." The girl nodded, not looking at her. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. They sat like that for a long while, saying nothing, just two people breathing in rhythm with the wind. Eventually, the girl stood up, wiped her face, and picked up her backpack. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Lena nodded. "Any time." The girl walked away slowly, and Lena watched until she disappeared down the dirt road. She turned back to the tree and touched the turquoise pendant. It was warm from the sun. Later that evening, Lena sat on the porch with a mug of tea, her father's rocker swaying gently in the twilight breeze. The tree stood just beyond the porch steps, its silhouette dark against the fading sky, necklace glinting faintly in the low light. She thought about how often she had waited for her father to speak first. How many moments passed them by because neither of them knew how to reach across the silence. But in the end, he had. In his own way. A note in a cedar box. A headdress tucked away for decades. And now, somehow, that quiet strength had passed to her. The next day, she returned to the community center early and placed a new project on the table. Each child would make something to leave at the dancing tree. Not to sell, not to gift, just to offer. A message, a bead, a piece of yarn, whatever felt right. It's not about being seen, she told them. It's about showing up. The response was immediate. That week, dozens of little tokens appeared beneath the tree. Tiny dream catchers, feathers wrapped in twine, little notes. I miss you. Come home soon. I love you. Keanu passed by a few days later, as he often did during his morning walks. He paused at the tree, taking in the quiet memorial it had become. Lena stepped out to greet him, offering a smile. She's getting visitors, she said, nodding toward the tree. She's got a good host, Keanu replied. They stood in silence for a while. Two people stitched together by loss, by resilience, by presence. Lena thought again of what he had said that day over tea, about regret and goodbyes, and how sometimes the quietest moments were the ones that spoke the loudest. Before he left, Keanu pulled something from his pocket. A smooth stone, painted with a swirl of deep blues and ochres. For the tree, he said, placing it gently beneath the lowest branch. Lena didn't need to say thank you. He already knew. That night, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. The necklace twirled in the air, casting soft shadows across the ground like dancing spirits. Lena sat on the porch long after the sun had gone down, watching it move. The pain was still there, but so was peace. And somewhere in the middle of both was love. The next weekend, Lena brought out a small wooden bench and placed it beside the tree. She carved a simple inscription into the wood with her father's old pocket knife. For those learning how to say goodbye. Neighbors began to linger longer now, bringing children, quiet thoughts, and even cups of coffee. The tree had become more than just a tree. It was a resting place for unspoken things. Grief, gratitude, memory, hope. One afternoon, a woman approached Lena after class. I lost my son last year, she said, holding back tears. But when I sat by your tree, I felt like I could breathe again. Lena didn't know what to say, so she simply placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. That night, Lena sat alone with her journal and wrote one line. Maybe love isn't what you say, maybe it's what you stay for. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the porch. The necklace on the tree swayed once, then again. And Lena smiled, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had softened into something bearable, something shared. The tree stood tall in the dark, branches outstretched, still dancing, still healing. In the days that followed, Lena began wearing her father's old jacket while working the garden. It still smelled like cedar and tobacco, and somehow it made her feel less alone. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, tucked beneath a smooth stone on Lena's porch. There was no envelope, no signature, just her name, handwritten on a folded page with the kind of slanted cursive that carried weight. She recognized it instantly. Keanu's handwriting. She stepped outside, the breeze lifting the edge of her robe as she bent down to retrieve it. For a moment, she simply held the letter. The sunlight made the ink shimmer faintly, as though the words themselves had waited for the right light to be seen. She sat on the porch swing, heart thudding gently, and opened it. Lena, thank you for letting me witness something sacred. You reminded me that healing isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and brave. She clutched the page a little tighter and read on. You probably don't remember this, but your father helped me once, long ago. I had lost someone I didn't know how to live without. I came to this town looking for silence. I found your garden instead. I was just some lost man with a broken past, and he offered me a seat, nothing more. We didn't talk. But he didn't make me leave. Lena's chest ached. She had wondered for weeks why Keanu never explained their connection, why he came and went without seeking attention or offering grand gestures. Now she understood. Told me nothing, and yet it was everything. A kindness I never forgot. I returned to the city, but something stayed behind. Maybe it was a piece of my sorrow. Maybe it was a seed of something softer. The words settled over her like morning dew. I saw how you tried to reach him, not through speeches or declarations, but through meals, music, the way you sat beside him without demand. You mirrored the same strength he showed me. I don't think he knew how to say the words, Lena, but he danced with you in his own way. She stopped reading to cry. The porch creaked beneath her as she stood and walked slowly to the garden. Her bare feet pressed into the earth, still damp with dew. She carried the letter with both hands, as if it were made of glass. She sat on the low wooden bench beside the cedar box that now lived under the shade tree. Carefully, she opened it. Inside were the memories she had collected. Her father's note, the small headdress, the turquoise beads from the necklace. With trembling fingers, she placed Keanu's letter inside, sliding it next to her father's folded words. 2 men, 2 messages, 1 heart. She closed the lid and let her fingers rest on the top of the box, letting silence settle around her. A bird chirped in the distance. A squirrel rustled through the garden path. Then Lena did something she hadn't done in weeks. She smiled. Not a big, beaming grin, but a small, aching smile of someone who had been seen, who had been loved, even in silence, even across time. Keanu was gone now, returned to whatever life he led before, but his presence lingered, not in his footsteps, but in the reminder he left her. That goodbye could be a beginning, too. Later that day, Lena returned to her workshop, where sunlight poured through the open window and dust motes danced in the air like slow-moving spirits. She hadn't created anything new since her father passed. The beads had sat in silence, waiting for her hands to remember. But today felt different. She pulled out her tools, set a fresh coil of copper wire on the table, and began threading turquoise pieces one by one. As her fingers worked, her mind wandered to Keanu's letter. Its reverent tone, its grace. He hadn't tried to fix anything, he simply honored what had already been. It was the kind of goodbye that left space for something to grow. By nightfall, Lena had finished a new piece, delicate, strong, quiet. She named it Echo, not for sorrow, but for the way healing had rippled through her life, without raising its voice. She lit a candle beside the cedar box and placed the necklace next to it, not as an offering, but as an answer. Healing, she realized, wasn't the erasure of pain. It was the invitation to carry love forward, quietly, bravely, and with hands that now knew how to let go. The next morning, a knock came at the community center door just before class began. A young girl, maybe 12, stood nervously in the hallway, clutching a folded paper flower. "Are you Ms. Lena?" she asked. Lena nodded gently. "My mom said you taught her how to make earrings once," the girl said. "She made some for her wedding." Lena smiled and opened the door wider. "Come in, we're just getting started." The girl entered shyly and took a seat at the round table, where beads of every color glittered in shallow bowls. Lena watched her for a moment, then joined the circle. As the class went on, Lena noticed the girl staring at the tree outside the window, the one with the turquoise necklace, gently swaying from its lowest branch. She leaned over and whispered, "That's the dancing tree. Some people say it helps you remember who you miss." The girl nodded solemnly. "I miss my grandpa." Lena placed a warm hand over hers and said softly, "Then you're in the right place." That day, Lena taught her how to string memory into beauty, just as her father had unknowingly done for her. That evening, Lena returned to the cedar box once more. She opened it slowly, lifting Keanu's letter again and rereading the final lines. "Your father danced with you in his own way." And it was beautiful. She pressed the page to her heart, then tucked it back in beside her father's note. The 2 papers rested there like 2 hands folded in prayer. As the sun dipped low behind the horizon, Lena sat on the porch steps and watched the shadows stretch across the field. The trees swayed, and the necklace chimed softly in the breeze. In that moment, Lena understood something deeper than words. She hadn't needed her father to change who he was. She had only needed the courage to love him exactly as he'd been, and the grace to see that he'd been loving her in return, in his own quiet way. And Keanu? He had come and gone like the wind, but what he left behind would echo forever. Because some letters are never meant to be sent. They're meant to be found when the heart is finally ready to read them. And so she waited. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The idea came to Lena late one evening while washing her hands in the kitchen sink. The water ran warm over her fingers and the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't settle but lingers like a weight. She looked out the window toward the backyard, past the cedar tree and the rocking chair that hadn't moved in weeks. Something in her heart whispered, "You're not the only one missing someone." So she wrote a note on a small scrap of paper and tacked it to the bulletin board at the community center. Fire Circle, a gathering for those who miss someone. No speeches, no expectations, just come. Below it, she scribbled a time and place. Friday, 7 p.m. The clearing at the edge of town, near the old well. She didn't tell many people. Just a few neighbors, some elders, a friend from the market. She didn't know if anyone would show up. But maybe, just maybe, there were others who carried quiet grief. Ones who didn't need words so much as warmth. That afternoon, Lena gathered firewood from the edge of her father's land. The smell of pine and earth clung to her sleeves as she stacked the logs in the bed of an old pickup, the same truck her father once drove. Its engine coughed but didn't stall. She smiled at that. When she arrived at the clearing, the sky was fading into deep oranges and purples. The field was silent, except for the gentle rustle of the cottonwoods overhead. She arranged the stones in a circle, laid the wood with care, and struck a match. The first flames crackled softly, alive, hungry, dancing. Lena wrapped her shawl tighter and waited. The first person to arrive was Mrs. Redfeather, an elder from the reservation. She walked slowly, leaning on a carved stick, and took a seat without a word. Then came a young mother from town, her toddler asleep in a sling against her chest. A man in his 60s followed, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets, eyes red but dry. They didn't ask questions, they didn't talk. They just came. By the time the fire was steady and full, nearly 24 people had gathered, some seated on stumps, others cross-legged on blankets. The circle glowed under the stars, a soft halo in the dark. And just beyond the tree line, Lena saw him. Keanu. He stood half-shrouded in shadow, one hand in his coat pocket, the other hanging at his side. He didn't move forward. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Lena's eyes met his across the firelight. She gave him the smallest nod. He nodded back. Lena looked around the circle, her heart swelling at the sight of strangers united by silence. No announcements, no introductions. Just flickering light, quiet breathing, and the shared weight of remembering. Someone tossed a cedar branch onto the fire and it snapped with a high hiss, sending a brief burst of sweet smoke into the air. Lena closed her eyes. Her father used to burn cedar whenever the power went out. He claimed it cleared the air and the mind. She never believed it back then, but now it felt like peace. Across the fire, a teenage boy pulled a photograph from his pocket. He didn't speak, just stared at it with glistening eyes, then tucked it into his jacket. Next to him, the old man, who had come alone, whispered something into the flames. A name, maybe, or a prayer. It didn't matter. It belonged to the night. Lena didn't plan to speak. She had organized this as a gesture, not a performance. But something stirred in her chest, the way a bird flutters when it knows it's time to fly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the note her father had left with the headdress. She'd carried it every day since the morning he passed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The words weren't long, just 6 of them, barely legible from years of quiet living, and one final moment of courage. "I was always proud. just didn't know how to say it. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't have to. Instead, Lena held it up for a moment so the firelight could catch it, and then she let it drift into the flames. It curled slowly, paper turning amber, then black, then gone. Gasps rippled quietly through the circle, not because of spectacle, but because everyone there understood. Letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about honoring. Behind her, a soft crunch of boots against pine needles. Keanu had stepped just slightly forward into the outer glow of the fire. He still didn't sit, didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. Lena gave him a gentle half-smile, thanking him without needing to. A woman near the edge of the circle began humming, a soft melody, barely audible. It wasn't a song anyone knew, just something rising from the stillness. And then, as if by instinct, others began to hum along. Low, resonant, healing. Lena's eyes brimmed again, but she didn't wipe the tears. She let them fall, hot and silent. This wasn't grief. It was release. The humming rose and fell like waves, soft enough not to disturb the night, but strong enough to hold every heart in the circle. A woman gently placed a shell into the fire. Someone else dropped a single bead. One by one, they each added something. Tokens of memory, pieces of the past, quiet acts of closure. Lena stayed seated, watching the flames dance over the offerings. Each flicker, each crackle, felt like a soul exhaling. There were no speeches, no final words, just a circle of people who'd carried too much for too long, now finally allowed to set something down. When the fire began to dim, people started to stand, slowly, respectfully. No one rushed. No one asked what happened next. They simply touched each other's shoulders or nodded, then disappeared into the trees, into the dark, into their own lives, a little lighter than they'd arrived. Lena remained by the fire until the last ember dimmed. When she stood, she felt a presence beside her. Keanu. He didn't speak. He didn't offer condolences or wisdom. Instead, he handed her something, wrapped gently in cloth. She opened it, a feather, small and gray pool, wrapped in a thin strand of leather. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She used to say it carried prayers. I think it belongs here now." Lena held it with both hands, reverently. "Thank you." He nodded, then stepped back into the shadows. No farewell, no fanfare, just the sound of his boots retreating into the night. Lena turned back to the fire pit. She crouched and placed the feather on the still warm stones, right at the center. For a moment it caught the moonlight, soft, glowing, eternal. As she stood, the wind rustled through the clearing, brushing her face like a breath from someone unseen. She didn't know if her father was watching. She didn't know if anything waited beyond this life. But she did know this. She had danced with him in silence, honored his memory with flame, and offered her own heart to others in their grief. And maybe that was enough. Maybe love, when spoken through action instead of words, still finds its way home. Lena walked back through the forest path alone, the night cool on her cheeks, her chest warm with something she couldn't quite name. Behind her, the fire circle remained, empty, sacred, and still burning, somewhere inside them all. The summer sun dipped low over the hills, casting long golden streaks across the valley where the annual tribal gathering was already in full swing. Drums echoed gently through the air, blending with the scent of fry bread, cedar smoke, and earth warmed by the day. Children ran barefoot near the creek. Elders sat in canvas chairs beneath the shade of old cottonwoods, telling stories with their eyes as much as their words. Lena stood at the edge of the circle, watching it all unfold with a heart full of both quiet ache and gentle pride. It had been 5 years since her father passed. 5 years since the night they danced without moving in the backyard, with nothing but string lights and the kind of silence that said everything. Since then, Lena had kept her promise. To live more fully, love more openly, and share what she had learned through loss. Her niece, Willow, tugged gently at her skirt. "Auntie, are we going to dance?" Lena looked down. The girl was 11 now, colt-legged and shy, wearing a ribbon skirt Lena had helped her sew just 2 weeks ago. Her hair was braided neatly, and her beadwork earrings sparkled like the evening sky. Lena smiled. "Do you want to?" Willow shrugged, clearly uncertain. "I don't know the steps." "You don't have to," Lena said softly, bending to adjust the hem of the girl's skirt. "You just have to show up." The dance circle pulsed with energy, young men in regalia moving with fierce precision, elder women swaying with grace passed down from generation to generation. But it was open now, as the intertribal song began. Anyone could join, anyone willing to share the rhythm. Lena stepped forward first, her moccasins brushing the packed earth. She took Willow's hand in hers, not tugging, not insisting, just holding. The girl followed. At first, their movements were tentative, more like walking than dancing. Lena focused on the drum beat, steady, ancient, alive. Each beat was a heartbeat, each step a remembrance. Willow started to smile, not the wide kind that asked for attention, but the small, knowing one of someone realizing they were safe. Lena looked across the circle and froze. There, just beyond the last row of spectators, near the line of pine trees that bordered the field, stood Keanu Reeves. Older now, gray brushing the edges of his beard, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, his hands in his pockets. He didn't wave, didn't try to draw attention. He just stood there, smiling faintly. Lena's chest tightened, but not with pain, more like gratitude. He hadn't said goodbye when he left, just a letter, just a feather, just presence. And now, somehow, he was here, still showing up, still keeping rhythm. Willow's hand squeezed hers, bringing Lena back to the moment. The two of them moved slowly now, stepping in time with the beat. Other dancers passed by, some in full regalia, others barefoot in jeans, but all carried the same pulse. All were joined by something older than memory. The beat of the drum was like thunder softened by forgiveness. Lena glanced again toward the edge of the crowd. Keanu was still there, watching, not intruding. She remembered how he once stood on the same kind of margin years ago, on the edge of her life, offering no answers, only presence. That's what he had given her. Not solutions, not sympathy. Space. A place to be seen without being judged. A place where pain could be held instead of explained. Willow twirled clumsily beside her, then laughed. Lena let go of her hand, giving her room to try her own steps. The girl raised her arms slightly and found her own rhythm. Awkward, joyful, genuine. Lena didn't correct her. She didn't lead. She just watched. And then, as the drum changed tempo, Lena closed her eyes and let her own feet move. Not to impress, not to perform, but to remember. She saw her father's chair. She saw the light. She felt his hand. And for a moment, it was like she was dancing with him again. Not in the yard, not in silence, but here, among family, community, the ancestors. The music rose, crescendoed, then softened again as the singers drew out the final phrase. One by one, the dancers slowed. Some stopped. Others turned and left the circle. But Lena stayed. Willow ran over and hugged her around the waist. "You looked so happy," she said breathlessly. "I was," Lena whispered. "Did you dance with Grandpa when you were little?" Lena hesitated, her throat tightening. "No," she said softly. "Not really." Willow tilted her head. "Then how did you know how to dance?" Lena smiled at her. "I waited until I could feel the music inside me." "Did it take a long time?" "A very long time," Lena said, brushing a strand of hair from her niece's cheek. Willow thought about that. "But you're here now." "I am," Lena said. "And so are you." They stood hand in hand, watching the sunset bleed across the hills. In the fading light, Keanu gave a small wave, just 2 fingers, barely noticeable. Lena returned it with a nod. She didn't call out. She didn't need to, because some people didn't belong in every chapter. But they helped you write the ones that mattered most. The fire pits were being stoked now, and families gathered near them with blankets and drums of their own. Someone passed Lena a plate of roasted corn and beans. She thanked them but set it aside for later. Her appetite wasn't for food tonight. It was for memory, for the kind that nourished something deeper. Willow was busy chatting with another girl her age, showing off the beadwork Lena had taught her to do. Her laughter rang clear through the dusk. Lena walked slowly toward the circle's edge, where the grass met the open field. The music had stopped, but she could still feel the rhythm beneath her feet, like it had imprinted itself on the ground. Keanu was gone. No sign of him now, just a footprint in the dry earth where he'd stood. And somehow, that was perfect. He didn't need applause. He didn't stay for recognition. He came when it mattered and left when the story was ready to close. That was his way. That had always been his way. Lena sat on a log near the outer ring of the field. The stars were starting to blink into place, one by one. She looked up, then pulled something small from her skirt pocket. A feather, white-tipped, worn. Keanu had tucked it into the letter he left her before moving back to the city. She never asked what bird it was from. She just knew it had meaning. She placed the feather gently in the center of her palm, then pressed it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Not just to him, but to her father, to the silence that taught her how to listen, to the pain that shaped her strength, to the years that carved space for grace. The wind picked up, soft and warm. It rustled the trees like a voice too old for language. Lena stood again, her fingers grazing the bark of the tree nearest the circle. She traced the grooves as if reading a message only she could decipher. She would come back next year. She would bring others. She would keep dancing. Because she understood something now, something Keanu once hinted at in a quiet afternoon over tea. You don't need music to make meaning. You don't need a stage to be seen. You don't need words to say, "I love you." You just need to show up. And tonight, Lena had shown up. For her father, for her niece, for herself. As the last embers of the fire flickered into the dark, Lena stepped away from the field with the kind of peace that comes only after a story has finished telling itself, not in chapters, but in steps. In silence. And in the dance. The sky was bright over the hills that morning, soft clouds drifting lazily across the blue. Lena stood by the tree they'd planted for her father, now taller than she remembered, its leaves swaying in rhythm with the breeze. The turquoise necklace hung from one of its lower branches, catching light in flashes of blue and silver. The bone bead in the center had faded, but its meaning hadn't. She reached for it slowly, holding it in her hands as though it were something sacred. It was. Her niece, Willow, was nearby, helping rake around the base of the tree. Her dark braids were tied with thin strips of red cloth, just like Lena's had been when she was her age. The garden nearby buzzed with bees and hummingbirds, colors bursting from the wildflowers she and Willow had planted over the past 2 seasons. The tree had become a place they returned to after school, after hard days, or just when silence was needed. Lena turned to her niece and knelt in the soil. "I want you to have this," she said gently, holding out the necklace. Willow blinked. "The one from the tree?" Lena nodded. "The one from the garden, from before Grandpa passed." "From Keanu." Willow's eyes widened slightly. "But it's yours." It was. And before that it was something I made to say thank you. But it became something more. Lena paused, running her thumb over the bone bead. It reminded me to listen, to forgive, to stay. And now I want it to remind you to hold space for people, to trust your voice, and to never think silence means someone doesn't love you. Willow looked at the necklace like it held the sun itself. "I'll never lose it," she whispered. Lena smiled. "You don't have to wear it every day, but when you do, let it speak for the things you don't know how to say." She fastened it around Willow's neck, careful not to pull her hair. The turquoise sat just above her heart. Willow reached up and touched it gently. They sat there for a while, side by side in the earth, not talking. The wind rustled the tree above them. A few leaves spiraled down, brushing their shoulders. And for a moment it felt like time had folded in on itself, like Lena was both the girl seeking approval and the woman who had finally understood how much she'd always had. Later that afternoon, Lena and Willow walked the short path to the community center. It was a small adobe building with cracked windows and the faint smell of sage always lingering inside. Every Wednesday, Lena taught jewelry making to a group of children from the nearby reservation and the surrounding rural neighborhoods. The class had grown over time, not because of ads or flyers, but because of stories. Kids told their cousins, who brought their siblings, who brought their friends. They came not just to make things, but to be heard. Lena always made sure of that. As Willow set up trays of beads and cord, Lena pulled out a small weathered journal. Inside were sketches of her father's old rocking chair, notes about types of turquoise, stories whispered to her in childhood, and words she'd never said aloud. This was her second gift, what she'd someday pass to Willow with the necklace. When the kids arrived, Willow stood beside her aunt, wearing the turquoise necklace with quiet pride. One of the younger girls pointed at it. "Did you make that?" Willow smiled. "My aunt did, a long time ago." Lena looked over and added softly, "It was made as a thank you for someone who helped us remember how to listen." The girl didn't ask more. She just nodded, as if she understood something without needing to name it. They worked with their hands, wrapping wire, tying knots, stringing beads under the warm glow of the afternoon sun coming through the windows. Every now and then Lena glanced at Willow, her steady fingers, the necklace glinting with each movement. Her calm presence. The girl who once used to sit in silence now taught others how to find beauty in stillness. After class, Lena and Willow walked home in the golden light, past fields and fences, the trees swaying in the distance. "Do you think Grandpa would have liked the class?" Willow asked, voice soft. "I think he would have sat in the back," Lena said nothing, maybe nodded once, but yes. "I think he would have liked it." Willow smiled. "Me too." They turned onto their gravel driveway, passing by the old rocker that now sat empty beneath the porch awning. Sometimes birds perched on its arms. Sometimes the wind rocked it gently. Lena never moved it. It belonged there. Willow paused beside it, her fingers brushing the armrest. "I think I'll sit here later," she said. Lena placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's yours too now." That evening, after the dishes were washed and the house grew quiet, Lena lit a small candle and stepped outside alone. The air was cool, the stars wide open above her. She walked to the tree, the one they'd planted after the last dance, and looked up at its branches. The spot where the necklace once hung was now bare. In its place, a small ribbon fluttered. Willow had tied it there earlier that day. Red, like the ties in her braids. Lena sat in the grass beneath the tree, her fingers brushing the soil. She thought of the cedar box still tucked beneath her bed, holding her father's note, Keanu's letter, and one final bead she hadn't yet used, a piece of turquoise, imperfect, but strong. She would save it for Willow's first student. Somewhere in the distance, a pair of coyotes howled low and mournful, then faded into the quiet. Lena didn't flinch. The night was not a place of fear anymore. It was a place of memory, of presence, of things finally said through things finally done. She closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "Thank you for seeing me." From the porch, Willow watched her aunt with the kind of stillness Lena had once learned to carry. She didn't call out, didn't interrupt, just watched. In that silence was a kind of inheritance, not of land or wealth or blood, but of belonging. The porch light flickered once, then held steady. Later, Lena returned inside and pulled out her journal. She flipped past sketches, quotes, and pressed wildflowers until she reached a blank page. In careful strokes, she wrote, "What we pass down isn't always what we say. Sometimes it's what we wear. Sometimes it's how we listen. And sometimes it's a necklace made of turquoise and bone. quietly handed to the one who needs to remember. You were never invisible. She closed the journal gently and placed it on the nightstand. In the morning, she would show Willow how to make a clasp that never broke. And maybe, just maybe, one day Willow would pass it on again. To someone with questions, with silence, with a need to be seen. And that would be the next story, the next dance, the next gift. The sun filtered softly through the swaying limbs of the tree, casting flickers of gold and shadow across Lena's sketchpad. She sat cross-legged in the grass, her back resting against the thick trunk, the roots curling beneath her like a cradle. Her hands moved gently, drawing curves and swirls, shaping beads in her mind before they took form in the world. The necklace hung from the low branch above her, the same one she had given to Keanu, now returned, now repurposed. It shimmered faintly in the breeze, dancing in the air just enough to catch the light, but not enough to make a sound. Lena paused in her sketching, closed her eyes, listened. There was no music playing, no voices, no words, and yet she felt it all. The warmth of her father's hand in hers, the silence that had once hurt, now transformed into peace. The gentle pull of memory, not as an anchor, but as a tether to something tender and eternal. A moment. That was all it had taken. She opened her eyes and smiled, reaching up to steady the necklace as the wind tugged again. She wrapped her fingers around it, just for a second, and then let it go. From the house, Willow's laughter echoed faintly. Lena turned her head and watched her niece chase a dog across the yard, her braids flying behind her like ribbons on the wind. It had taken years for Lena to understand what she truly wanted from her father. Not words, not even an apology. She had wanted to be seen. And she had been, in the backyard, under the lights, in the squeeze of a hand, in a single tear shed without shame. That was the conversation they never had, but always needed. She resumed sketching. A new design began to form beneath her pencil. A necklace of 3 stones, turquoise, bone, and cedar wood, joined in a spiral. She labeled it in her journal, The Dance. She would teach Willow how to make it next week. Maybe they would string it together beneath the tree. A quiet breeze brushed across her shoulders again. She looked up through the canopy and smiled softly. The tree had grown taller. She remembered Keanu's words. If you were going to choreograph a goodbye, what would it look like? Lena never got the goodbye she had imagined, but she got something better. A beginning, one that unfolded without grandeur or noise, but with grace and presence. The kind of ending that didn't close the book, but added a final chapter you didn't know was missing. She stood slowly, brushing grass from her jeans, and walked to the garden. The flowers had bloomed late this year, but they were blooming. She knelt down, pulling weeds with care, adjusting the stones around the border her father once built by hand. A shape caught her eye near the porch gate, a bundle of fresh wildflowers wrapped in twine. She knew who left them. Keanu never rang the bell. He just passed by, left something behind, and moved forward. Lena picked up the bouquet and brought it inside, placing it in the old mason jar by the kitchen window. She watched the light catch the petals, another gift that needed no explanation. Later, she sat at the dining table with Willow. They shared stew and cornbread, passed down through memory more than recipes. Lena pulled out the new sketch and slid it across the table. Willow's eyes lit up. This one's for the next dance? Lena nodded. Yes, and the next after that. They ate in silence, comfortable now, the kind of silence that was no longer heavy, but healing. That evening, Lena walked back outside for one last moment alone. She sat under the tree again, the sketch pad now closed, the light fading behind the horizon. She pressed her back to the bark and exhaled deeply. The necklace above her stirred once more. A voice echoed, soft, low, familiar. It wasn't real, and yet it was more real than anything she'd ever heard. Keanu's voice in her memory. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe, because someone out there might be waiting for their last dance. Lena looked to the sky, stars just beginning to bloom in the navy twilight. She didn't need words to answer. She only needed the heartbeat in her chest and the necklace above her to remind her that everything she thought was lost had never truly left. Somewhere in the quiet, the next story was already beginning, and she was ready to hear it.